This is the Carsey School's contribution to UNH's year-long sesquicentennial celebration. And for this, we're very excited to welcome Nathan Sorber, who's a national expert on the history of land-grant universities. And after he speaks, we'll be joined by two panelists, Nancy Targett, our provost, and Steve Taylor for a discussion that I'll be moderating. I do direct the Carsey School. We have two master's degree programs, and we do engage in research and policy analysis and civic engagement. I would be remiss not to mention that this program is also sponsored by the Rudman Public Forum Series, which honors the late U.S. Senator Warren Rudman. The university-wide series honors Senator Rudman's lifelong commitment to public service, democracy, and dialogue to address the pressing issues of our times. Before I more formally introduce, I'm going to move this to the side. Before I more formally introduce our speaker and the panel, I wanted to just say a couple of things about why what Dr. Sorber and we're going to talk about is of particular interest to me. The period of the Lincoln presidency, when the land-grant institutions when that law was passed, I've always felt has been a little bit underappreciated in the arc of public policy making history in the United States. People kind of jump from the founding era of the Articles of Confederation, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, the foundational Supreme Court cases to the progressive era in response to industrialization, and then to the Great Society, and then to sort of in the late 70s and early 80s, the backing off from the big investments and interventions in society and the economy. And you know, the Lincoln era actually, it obviously gets dominated in our thinking by the Civil War, which, you know, a public policy fight that results in 600,000 people dying is gonna, you know, kind of get the attention, and the end of slavery was obviously a huge landmark in our country's history, and the ratification of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments connected with that. That's obviously the big thing that happened in the Lincoln presidency. But people forget about the Morrill Act, which Dr. Sorber will discuss, the National Banking Acts, which created a national currency and which were really laid the foundation for a modern economy. The first income taxes were actually adopted by both the North and the South to pay for the Civil War. The Homestead Act, which it's estimated that 30% of Americans are descended from people who homesteaded, who got free land, including me, actually. You know, and you think about how the country might be different if that land had just been open to the highest bidder, or with the portion of it that was occupied by Native Americans, if it had been left in their hands. The Transcontinental Railroad was chartered. So, you know, people forget about all of these things happening in this era and how really foundational important they were for what came afterwards. So I'm, you know, very excited to hear from Dr. Sorber about one very important piece of that. Let me introduce Dr. Sorber. He is the co-author of The Land-Grant Colleges and the Reshaping of American Higher Education, as well as a forthcoming book, The Morrill Act in Yankeedom, A History of the Origins and Early Years of the Land-Grant Colleges. He has written extensively on land-grant colleges, the history of American higher education more generally, and the relationship between higher education and American capitalism. He teaches on these subjects at West Virginia University, where he is an assistant professor of higher education administration and the program coordinator of the higher education program. He has his PhD in higher education from Penn State, a master's in education from Vanderbilt, and a bachelor's in economics and political science from Bucknell. Before I invite Dr. Sorber up, I'm also going to introduce our two panelists, just so we can get right into the conversation after he's done speaking. Nancy Targett, our provost and vice president for academic affairs here at UNH, began that in September. Prior to coming to UNH, she was the president at the University of Delaware. She's also served as dean of the University of Delaware's College of Earth, Ocean, and Environment, and she's a nationally recognized expert on ocean issues and has led or served on several important national boards and commissions in that capacity. Steve Taylor is an independent scholar, farmer, journalist, and longtime public official. He has been a newspaper reporter and editor and served for 25 years as New Hampshire's Commissioner of Agriculture. At UNH, he served a record-setting tenure as an ex officio member of the University System Board of Trustees. He was the recipient of the 2009 Charles Holmes Petty Medal, which is awarded annually by the UNH Alumni Association in recognition of outstanding accomplishment or distinguished service to the state, nation, or world. He was the founding executive director of the New Hampshire Humanities Council, and with his sons, he now operates a dairy, maple syrup, and cheese-making enterprise. So with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Sorber. Thank you.
Thank you all. It's such an honor to be at this wonderful university, and I got to spend some time in the lovely town here in Durham, and it's really been a great experience. I want to just thank the Carsey School of Public Policy, the UNH administration, faculty, my fellow panelists this evening, our moderator, Michael Ettlinger, for that nice introduction, and of course, all of you for joining us for what I hope will be an engaging and thought-provoking event. I should also thank Dartmouth for dropping the ball so many years ago so we could move here tonight and have this great event at this great campus. I thought that would sell. I thought a Dartmouth joke would go. Okay. So, my talk tonight is entitled How Land-Grant Universities Transformed American Higher Education, the Past as a Foundation for the Future. And yes, it's based on 2 books. Most of my comments tonight are going to focus on my forthcoming book, The Morrill Act and Yankeedom, which is a history of New Hampshire and in Connecticut and Massachusetts and Maine and Vermont, and a very unique history in the overall land-grant arc. I'm going to discuss how the land-grant movement progressed through 3 stages between 1862 and 1914, what I call the origin stage, the Reformation stage, and the standardization stage. I'm going to spend most of my time on the first 2 because that's where UNH comes into the story and help to kind of understand how this institution emerged. I'll conclude with some thoughts on where we are today and kind of transition us into our conversation on contemporary issues in land-grant education. So let me just introduce the legislation. Right, it was first introduced in 1857 by Representative Justin Morrill of Vermont. It would pass both chambers before being vetoed by President Buchanan in one of his many fine decisions in 1859. The Morrill Act we know today was then reintroduced by Senator Morrill after the start of the Civil War. The Act's main opponents were Southern congressmen, always fearful of federal incursion into state issues, but as they departed with their state secession, the Morrill Act passed in 1862 with little debate, signed by President Lincoln on July 2nd of that year. The law authorized the distribution of 30,000 acres of federal land per each congressional representative for those states not in rebellion against the United States at the time, that could then be sold as the basis of a permanent higher education endowment for the various states. The law said a little bit about purpose. It stipulated that the leading objects of these land-grant colleges shall be, quote, without excluding other scientific and classical studies, that part will be important, and including military tactics, to teach such branches of learning as are related to agriculture and the mechanic arts in order to promote the liberal and practical education of the industrial classes in the several pursuits and professions of life. So how do we make sense of the origins of this bill? So for a long time, we've had a traditional view of the land-grant colleges. Now, I'm going to call it the romantic view, the traditional view, and some of you might get a little upset with this as I go, but don't throw anything at me. But the traditional view has always been what we like to celebrate, right? That scholars, statesmen, campus presidents, the Morrill Act, from its beginning, it inaugurated democratization in American higher education. in two parts: the curriculum, practical studies, right? Agriculture, the mechanical arts that could appeal to the masses, and democratization of access. College, usually the domain of the professional classes, could now be open to the progeny of farmers and workers. And those two things together, we enter our celebrated phase of the beginnings of mass higher education. We also have Justin Morrill. He's in statues, you name libraries and buildings after him, right? He is our celebrated hero, son of a blacksmith, having been deprived of the opportunity of an education, was a passionately at the forefront of opening higher education beyond just the professional classes. Okay, so my origins view from my research, a lot of that is true. Okay, now I tell my students, this is the moment when I was in an undergrad history course and I finally researched my grandfather's history story about how my great-great-great-great-great-grandfather was a Revolutionary War hero and found out he was a loyalist that spent a lot of the time in prison during the war, and I had to deal with that. Okay, but it complexifies his motivations for us. The reason is I begin my book, and I begin this whole journey on studying land-grant institutions in 1888 in Vermont. And in Vermont, President Justin Buckham of Vermont is facing relentless criticism from the State Grange, an organization representing farmers, for failing to serve them, for not providing a curriculum that met their needs, for not being accessible to farmers and workers. Justin Morrill was there too. You want to guess on what side? President Buckham's side. He was standing with the University of Vermont saying that they were serving the needs of, they were serving what his expectations were for the Morrill Act. The answer to this riddle is also the answer, in my mind, to UNH, but we'll get to that in a second. So keep that in mind. I don't always view Justin Morrill as a progressive champion of democracy. Okay? Despite being yoked to the masses through his land-grant colleges, he didn't show much interest in expanding political participation to women, promoting the welfare of laborers, increasing political power of common people, said little about emancipating slaves. He was born the son of a blacksmith, but his most cherished mentors were New England merchants, traders, and investors, and it would be these men who shaped the young Whig Justin Morrill into a prototypical member of the Yankee bourgeoisie. He was a hard-nosed businessman who pursued debtors unmercifully, dismissed uncouth customers as backwoods, and worked tirelessly to accumulate wealth and capital by investing his profits in railroads, banks, and manufacturing. What did he do as a legislator? He was a stalwart defender of emerging industry. He opposed progressive reforms like the 8-hour workday and direct election of senators. He voted against women's suffrage and rarely mentioned the education of women when speaking of land-grant colleges. He spent most of his time, in addition to the Land-Grant Act, drafting and defending tariff legislation that protected American industry. Now, Justin Morrill is really important, and I love him, but understanding his motivation is critical. So what did he actually say when he was talking about this land-grant bill? On the floor, he says to his colleagues, American agriculture, manufacturing, and industry is being dwarfed by international competitors. He exclaimed, "It's enough to know that European governments seem eager to place their people ahead in the race for mastery." He discussed how scientific advances in England and France had led agricultural production to quadruple, while American yields had decreased in the previous decade. America's economic success depended on federal sponsorship of scientific education and research, and to these end, Morrill lectured Congress to make no blunder in the guidance of the industry of the country. Now, he also talked about being the son of a blacksmith, but he's talking about agriculture and industrial development. The other part that I'm revisiting in the origin story is this assumed uniformity, right? Which we know when we look at land-grant colleges today, they're very different, and they always have been. The Morrill Act language was vague and paradoxical. It welded together opposite views, practical and classical, right? Don't exclude for all the professional pursuits of life, be open to the industrial classes. What that means is the people that would be responsible for determining how that moral act would be operationalized would be state governments. Okay? So what I try to put forth is that understanding the development of land-grant institutions is more dependent on understanding the realities of local and state political and economic context, less than any romantic notion of grand democratic ideal. So we actually see many types of institutions. We see more vocational agricultural colleges in the Midwest, right? We see new state universities formed for the first time, like in West Virginia. Or we see in New England the moral act being attached to pre-existing private institutions. We also see very different models. Daniel Coit Gilman, who was at Yale's Sheffield Scientific School, Connecticut's land grant, who would go on to be president of the University of California and then most famously at Johns Hopkins, was very upset about how things went down with the legislation at the federal level. It passed too quickly in 1862. They didn't have a chance to have a robust debate and us all agree what these institutions could be. He had hoped that they would all be national schools of science. He had just returned from Germany. He had seen the universities at Gießen and Göttingen. And when he was there, he saw faculty members not only disseminating knowledge, but engaged in advancing knowledge as well. So we see many land-grant colleges, especially in the Northeast region, tending more towards this National School of Science model. Higher standards, advanced scientific and engineering curriculum, PhD faculty. But when you recruit PhD faculty or some leading scientists, these institutions become more costly. As such, they become less accessible. Also, if you're teaching high-level science, the admissions requirements need you to get up to above trigonometry, right? Not something that the average farm child of the farm was able to do. But you also had very vocational institutions out west in the Midwest, unified under what was called the Michigan Plan, which any student probably with a district school education could get into. Vocational curriculum, some more manual learning pedagogy, practicing farmers as faculty, and they had lower costs, and they were highly accessible. So what this means is, and as I've seen in my research, is that in places that use those high science model or National School of Science model, they weren't really democratizers. The same people that went to those colleges went to other colleges. That's why everybody was so upset at the University of Vermont. That's why the Grangers were so mad at Dartmouth, because those institutions were pursuing a different model of the land grant idea. And that's what we see in the early New Hampshire model in Hanover. The New Hampshire legislature considered some different proposals. One thing you need to know about the Land Grant Act is while the federal funds were to be a permanent endowment, only 10% of that funding could be used to any capital projects that we would say today. The New Hampshire legislature, then as now, I believe, was not interested in appropriating that much funding. And Dartmouth said, we will do it, we'll do it. The first person that's elected or that's appointed to run the institution, the land grant operation connected to Dartmouth is Ezekiel Diamond, and he's a perfect example of that scientific professor I was just discussing. He had training in Germany. He had been doing original research at Harvard's Lawrence Scientific School. And when he talked about manual training or vocational farm training, he said, no, we are not training boys here to blindly be taught the manual arts as monkeys are taught to perform tricks at the circus. His commitment was advanced scientific education. So when the populist movement emerges and the Grange starts to gain strength in places like New England, they critique on 3 points these type of models, like we saw at Dartmouth, Yale, Sheffield Scientific School, at Brown in Rhode Island. They're concerned about access. The high standards and impractical curriculum and costs were keeping farmer boys out. They were concerned about mobility. When farmers' progeny did get into these institutions, God forbid they became bankers. They left. They didn't return to the farm. They had a more advanced education. And now they were leaving the class, right? Leaving the solidarity with the Grange. And it was cultural. They saw places like Dartmouth or Brown as places run by dilettantes, upper middle class dandies, right? They did not want their boys to return as feminized working boys. They wanted working on the farm, real masculine men, not middle class, idle individuals. What was their solution? We needed, like the Michigan plan, open access, vocational curriculum, and we need education in a specific line. Don't teach them all this other stuff. Teach them farming, just farming, so they return. Our rural communities are losing people. They're losing them fast, and if you don't return them, brain drain today, right? And culture. We want less football, fraternities, general frivolity. We want required manual labor. So we have actual Grange campaigns. You know the one best here, but let me talk about a couple others just for a second. I said to you that legislatures they had a good thing going, that they had these private institutions footing part of the bill, but they had Grange pressure as well. But there were 2 other federal acts that changed the dynamic. The Hatch Act of 1887 provided funding that was supposed to go to agricultural experiment stations only. Rhode Island cheated and used it to create the University of Rhode Island. But the real money came in 1890, where land grant, the second Morrill Act, where land grant institutions got an additional $25,000 a year for every year to grow by 1,000 each year. This was real money now. Now that money could be used with some state money to create new institutions. Dartmouth, the Dartmouth response is different, hilarious in a hilarious way. While Yale and Brown are fighting to keep the land grant, Dartmouth is pushing it away. The reason is, and it kind of shows that how all these institutions were kind of cheating, is that Dartmouth, the arrangement with Dartmouth was that the New Hampshire Agricultural Mechanical School in Hanover kept some independence. They had an interlocking board of trustees, and the money could only go to that side of the house. So the president of Dartmouth couldn't get at the money. It stayed over on that side of the house. So when the Grange convinced New Hampshire to make a change, they were complaining, just like we saw elsewhere, that this is a classic Grange statistic in New Hampshire, 20% of graduates, only 20% of graduates are practicing farmers, whereas 39 are going into business or retail. This is just proof that Durham, that we need to go to Durham. It's proof that Dartmouth is not a good place to achieve their goals. So Dartmouth, the Dartmouth president expedites the move, and of course, we're here today. The situation was also altered by the reality. I'm sure many of you know the story well. Benjamin Thompson's bequest brings $408,000, which will have its own return. And what is the stipulation he puts with his will? The state has to give money too. And finally, New Hampshire gives over an appropriation to get us founded here, the University of New Hampshire. After the Reformation period ends, everything is not necessarily all rosy. There's dynamics happening in American culture. One of the things that's happening is we're seeing more public high schools being built all throughout New England, right? So we have more graduates interested in going to college. And places like University of New Hampshire, the new University of Rhode Island, that are built by Grange interests that are supposed to be more vocational. Before you know it, you have more and more middle-class families wanting a traditional education. You also have in these high schools vocational education going on, right? And so that, my point being that as you reach this standardization stage, what I call the state college ideal, it starts to become in all these agricultural schools' interest to start looking in similar ways, right? They get rid of manual labor almost as soon as they start it, and they start what? A football team, right? Because that's what the people demanding to come to the college want. And that's the first kind of standardization. Farmers are upset. Right after they won this, it seems that it's ripped out of their hands. But there's another movement afoot, a progressive era movement, a movement that's been started at Cornell and other places in the region as well, but the movement towards extension. And extension is not necessarily a legacy of the movement, it's a legacy of the people pushing back again against land-grant institutions for not doing enough to reach them where they are, to meet their needs. So what do we do with all this? It's a more complicated story when you arrive at the land-grant modern model of all these things wedded together, right? The legacy of that old scientific National School of Science Research University model that's part of what we do, the state college ideal, the teaching of undergraduates, the extension, right? We put it all together. That's what we do in a democracy to meet all these different needs. So we've reached that reality, and I think what I wanted to leave you with, or at least to think about as we move into the modern era, is what does that story afford us? Which I think is the accurate story, as opposed to just focusing on the romantic nature of we've thought about it in the past, that these things all emerged as this collective effort of we need to do better. No, it was a fight. The legacy of extension is not from the democratization, it's from the populist pushback, right? Us finding our current model is accommodating, competing, and diverse interests. So I guess my lesson then is in this history of competing interests and demands, we've seen a lot of different groups fighting for a piece of those federal and state spoils. When the Grange pressed, there at the University of Vermont and were fighting just immoral, or when they were fighting against Dartmouth to move it here, they were saying, we are not getting the benefit of this legislation. Sometimes it was a special interest, sometimes it moved the institution in a different direction, but the university showed some amazing agility to accommodate these competing demands on this legislation. So today, in this era of privatization that we're feeling more at West Virginia today, I know in New Hampshire you felt it first. You kind of led us down the path of where we're seeing land-grant institutions go. What is this idea going to mean in this era? Will the land-grant idea in an era of privatization become meaningless? Or can we create, again, not only a meaningful narrative of how we can serve the public good, but actually create an organizational saga that encourages institutional actors across all different parts of the university and have a shared commitment to public good conceptions, however they may be defined. And maybe, just maybe, by retailoring our efforts and reconnecting with the public, we can see an era of at least some renewed state support of American higher education. Thank you.
So thank you, Nathan. That was very interesting. I sort of want to just say, okay, Nancy and Steve, answer those questions he asked at the end, and actually, look, the Moral Act was passed however many years, a long time ago. I would just hear your reflections on, what is its relevance today? Is it in our DNA, or how does it manifest itself in what UNH is today?
So I think that I do think it's in our DNA, and I think a lot of the people who are here at this institution are here because they believe in the Moral Act and in the purposes of a land grant institution. I think it's messy. I think it's not always clear how we execute on that and where we're going in the future. I think the Academy right now across the U.S. is in a time of re-equilibration and renormalizing, and I think that's true for land-grant institutions as well as all institutions. And I think the strong institutions, particularly the land-grant institutions, will emerge from this in a way that they they redefine how they're connecting with the public and with the private sector in partnerships. And I think partnerships have always been key to the land-grant mission, and I think they will remain so, and they will be perhaps in different forms and formulations as we move forward, but it's that feedback loop between the public and the private sector and the institution that will remain important. Steve.
I'm fascinated with the history we've just heard. I'm sort of a scholar of that time in New Hampshire, particularly of the force of the Grange movement. And one little footnote to the establishment of the University of New Hampshire over here in Durham was something called the Grange School Law, or the Thompson Will case. And there were people who wanted to get Mr. Thompson's money and his land and go against his intent and his will. But the Grange hired some Sharpie lawyers from Manchester to defend the old man's will, and they would prevail in the probate court. And without that decision, history here would have been much different. But I'm particularly interested in the period during which cooperative extension took root in New Hampshire. And I would like to argue that cooperative extension did more to cement a bond between this institution and the people of New Hampshire than anything else. And it started up in my county in 1912. In 1912, in Sullivan County, there were 1,500 farmers. And a group of farmers got together and said, if we can get 600 of these guys to each put up $1, we could hire an agent, an expert, to bring us knowledge from the campus and from those experts down at Durham. And it was a great idea, and by golly, they pulled it off. And so in Sullivan County came to be the first extension office in the state. And the other counties soon followed suit. They saw what a great idea this was. And you burrow into the history, and you see what was accomplished by the establishment of cooperative extension in the counties in just a matter of about 5 or 6 years. They broadened it out from just agriculture to include youth programs and programs to help families in the home and help homemakers. And you know, one of the most interesting ones, a thing that they taught, people would go, they called them home demonstration agents, and they would go out in the countryside and gather some farm wives together. And one of the things they taught was the wisdom of boiling diapers. All right, well, you laugh, but in 1912, about 25% of babies died from strep and staph infections. And when you boil the diapers, you really put a stop to that. I mean, that was a profound thing. I mean, it sounds crazy today, but that was the kind of thing that was game-changing. And in agriculture, all kinds of things, ideas, new ideas, testing cows to see which ones made the most milk, and bringing in disease-free nursery stock, and on and on and on. And then with the coming of World War I, establishment of Victory Gardens. That was an extension initiative, but it got people in Merrimack Valley and all over say, look, we've got these people over at Durham that can come and help us grow our own food. what a great idea. And this just built over time. And so in my lifetime, the university, when I was a kid, was 4-H. I mean, boy, go down to Durham. They're going to have a program. You know, as kids, boy, let's go to Durham. And it just cemented, and it still does. Well, in my county, people think of UNH. They think of the little office over on the main street in Newport, where they have a couple of 3 or 4 people that bring the university to the grassroots. You can pick up the phone and say, I got a bug on the bush by my front door. I don't know what it is. And somebody will help you figure it out. Or I'm trying to can peaches, and they get bad after a couple of weeks. What am I doing wrong? You know, these kinds of little nitty-gritty things. But the university has that imprint on it. It's a brand. And long may it live.
Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. No.
May I just make one comment and just say that today, just to bring it up to today, there are 148 extension agents, and more than half of them are out in the 10 counties in the state, and they are doing small business development, working with kids, monitoring the water quality. There are just a whole host of things that these agents do and have direct impact in the state.
Yeah, no, I think that's really good. I think the real challenge is, you know, we all have, when we think about what drives our organizations, these rich sagas, these rich histories, and practices that we continue to commit to passionately because of that history, we also are faced with the challenges of challenging changing conditions, right? The great thing about the land grant idea, and not just as a label or as a brand, but there's a lot of things to pull from. Like, yes, the Cooperative Extension has a great, rich history. It's also true that when it started, 80% of the people were in agriculture in the country. There's a lot of states that have 2%, 1%, you know, and it could be a challenging conversation of how do we change Extension's portfolio? Should we change its portfolio to respond to issues in urban environments, to connect Extension to private players or to economic development? I don't get paid enough to make any of those decisions, but these are questions I think that land-grant institutions need to be asking, because we have to embrace this history, but we have to look and be smart and think about how we renegotiate it as it's always been renegotiated.
Nathan, I wonder if you could also, in the story you wove in your talk, you focused mainly on the contested turf, but Nancy referenced the partnership aspect of this, and I'm wondering if you could talk about that and how that developed, and how much partnerships were involved in the developing of the concept and its building out. Yeah, no, I think I told a part of the story that is absolutely contentious, and I think the idea about extension and how it grew and the contributions that land-grant institutions made to agricultural modernization and rural electrification and improving the lives of people in some very poor conditions. These were partnerships between county officials, state officials, land-grant institutions, regular people. I mean, it's a real powerful story of folks coming together. And later on, I mean, when we're talking in the 50s and 60s, the land-grant mission, that idea about access, the industrial classes, I mean, that was behind conversations of state legislatures putting more money in to grow campuses, or the passage of the Higher Ed Acts. You know, these same traditions about expanding access also can't be lost in this privatization world. As we increase tuition to $25,000, $30,000, $35,000, and we price out people in our state or in our communities, that can be a real challenge. But I still think there's a lot of people that want to come together around that idea in itself about providing accessible higher education to the best and brightest. Nancy, you said that it's in the university's DNA, or I said it and you agreed. I guess it's actually I shouldn't. But I guess the original, what instigated all of this was money, right? There was the land which could be converted to funds. And to some extent, the story Nathan has told is a sustaining of it or advancement of it was always money. And now the money picture is different than it used to be. And I'd just be interested in your thoughts on, how much of the future of embracing of the mission is connected to the availability of resources to do it?
So I think resources, of course, are an underpinning for all of this, but I thought that really what drove this was the desire to have a better competitive edge. So when you were referencing what people in the U.S. were seeing in Germany coming out of the science from them, and so it was a desire to move institutions in the U.S. to be more competitive, and particularly in the agricultural sector, but then that broadened beyond that. And so I think that's the underpinning piece of this. And of course, in order to be competitive, it does take resources. And so, but, I think about things, when I look at some of the impacts that New Hampshire has had on the world. So if you go back to 3 UNH graduates, the Hubbards, right, in the 1920s, right, and the disease-resistant chickens that they worked with people at the University of New Hampshire to help develop. And what is that? And we keep talking about how we change, and things change along the way. What did the development of those disease-resistant chickens, which, by the way, a third of the chickens in the world can trace their lineage back to that, but that foreshadows biotechnology, and that foreshadows all of the molecular work that we're doing today. So I think we have continued to adapt, and we have continued to give back to a community that then has been able to be more competitive, enhance productivity, and I think that's what it's all about. And does that take resources? It does.
I think we have to factor in the importance of quality. In this era right now, when we have a lot of, let's call it fly-by-night education on offer in the marketplace, to see parents and prospective students looking at the quality of the institution, and they see here's an opportunity to get an education at a premium value right here in our state is very, very powerful. And I think that, it traces way back, of course, to the farmers' boys who wanted to study agriculture. But in my community and my circle of friends, the idea of top quality institution with a wide array of offerings. I scan the UNH catalog online once in a while, and it's amazing what opportunities are there for students. I have 3 grandsons here now, and they come home and they tell me what they're studying. Holy smoke, it's wonderful. And people are making tremendous sacrifices in order to send their kids here. And that tells me that we have a wonderful brand, and that we have a tradition and a commitment to quality that means a great deal to people. And I think that is our greatest strength going forward. I know we worry about resources. Well, the biggest piece of resources now is the checkbooks of parents who are sending their kids here, and we need to make certain we recognize the sacrifices that are being made by families in New Hampshire and elsewhere for their kids to come here, and put a great deal of emphasis on preserving the image that we have, and that the quality of our institution remains high. It costs money, and somebody's got to pay for it. And I think an awful lot of parents are willing to pay for it because it's a good deal.
Yeah, some really good points. I just, I think the best leaders at land-grant institutions, I think, are capturing exactly what you're saying, that we recognize we have to do new things. The people in our communities are interested in economic development. They're interested in strong workforces and research that connects to innovation and commercial application. We have to be being part of that, being part of those private partnerships and increasing competitiveness in the state. I would add to that, though, that I think the best land grant leaders always recognize the complexities of all these moves. And I think There's a great book written in the 60s called Hard Tomatoes, Hard Times, which took a real kind of negative view of the land-grant act, because while we got beautiful tomatoes through agricultural modernization, while we got more productive, we also needed less farmers. So if we don't see both sides, if we don't fight for productivity and realize that rural communities are in a real tough shape, we're not doing both parts. So I think we can do that. I think we can push forward, be part of the knowledge frontier and innovation and economic development, but we have to be mindful of the realities of social and economic and cultural externalities that can come from some of that movement.
You're absolutely right. Right now, at the campus of the University of New Hampshire, they're researching ways to make cows make more milk. Well, we're swimming in milk, and there's so much milk in the national marketplace that they're dumping it out. There isn't enough customers. So, perfect illustration. I mean, we got an imbalance here, and we got to figure some of this stuff out better than we're doing.
But I do think that that's why so Cooperative Extension moved into some economic development areas. And when I look at the new strategic plan that was developed for UNH's Cooperative Extension, it really broadens the kinds of communities that they're touching and how we're interfacing and translating into, and the kinds of research. I think I would consider business innovation and entrepreneurship as part and parcel of the land-grant mission. I would think about the disability aspects of studies as part and parcel of the land-grant mission. So I would just define it. I think the definition has broadened over time as a result of that. I don't know if you agree with that or not.
So one thing that I picked this up from all three of you is a little bit of a tension between a transactional relationship with the state versus a more, a broader relationship based on broader objectives. And what the objectives were contested at the founding, but they were pretty broad objectives. It wasn't about whether it's a good deal for my kid to come to this school or whether my business can be helped. It was broader than that. And I'm wondering if any of you would like to just comment on, because if it comes back to support from the community as opposed to the transaction, how do you navigate that? Because clearly, if the future is going to be, if the university is going to be supported as well in the future as it has historically, it can't be on the basis of transaction, it would seem to me. So I'd be interested in your comments.
Yeah, no, I think I think the transactional relationship, the way we've looked at our relationships with higher education has partially fueled the tuition increases, right? I mean, it's more likely to hear people say, hey, they're getting a better job. They're going to have a better part, a better life. They should pay more of their education, right? Those, we call them neoliberal arguments, right? And there were times then that we didn't think about that we thought about, the extension of 13th, 14th, 15th, 16th grade as a public good, as something that in a community you had an educated citizenry and all boats were lifted from that broad support. We didn't think about it transactional. So I think it's always been there. I can't always put my foot on it. What was in the water in Wisconsin in the 1880s that seemed to create this broad-based acceptance of some of those progressive ideas. There's things driving it today, we know, right? State budget pressures, there's a lot of things that we do, demographics, older, all these things are costly. That's part of it too, but I think it's a mindset too. A different generation, this generation accepts to some degree that this is another transactional thing, that this is another consumer good. And that plays into our politics, that when state budget officers and legislatures are making decisions and they have to go somewhere, if there was that much pushback, they wouldn't go there, right? They wouldn't take money away from higher ed and see the tuition increases. But we've seen an acceptance by families. They are writing checks. They're accepting deferring with increased debt loads. I know a lot of folks are feeling pain, but there's not pitchforks maybe some legislatures, but so it tells me that culturally, folks do view this more in a transactional way than they have.
And I guess I would also say that within the institution, we're always mindful of debt load and the cost load for our students. And of course, many of you in the audience know that we just launched the Granite Guarantee. We try to do whatever we can to enhance the experience of our students on a whole bunch of different levels. The Hamill Scholars Program, these are all driven towards New Hampshire residents. So this is all specific to New Hampshire residents. I can't think of a way that you can be more land-grant centric than that. And so, again, within the institution, always thinking of ways to drive down costs, even as we are a really complex institution.
But let me just push a little on Nancy on the broader thing of connecting the university to the externalities of the university, the broader contribution it makes to the state and the community, either through, quantifying it in some way or having it be a source of civic pride. I wonder if you have any thoughts on how to move things in that direction, or whether you think that's actually a worthy goal or not.
I actually do think it's a worthy goal, and in fact, I do think that it's useful, the Cooperative Extension in particular, but a lot of our colleges and units at the university have their independent metrics of how many volunteer hours they've put out there, how many businesses they've impacted, how many youth. You would be astounded at the number of faculty, students here who give back to K through 12 education, for example, or who do things. I would bet, in fact, I'm willing to bet, maybe even bet my retirement pension on this. I would bet that if we were to tally this all up, it would be over 250,000 hours a year that people give back to this state. And in fact, one of the things I want to do is to in fact do that and to take a look at all that to sum it up in total so that we can have a number that is defensible that we can give back. Now, where I came from, we did that, and the reason why I could do a ballpark figure is where I came from and New Hampshire are not that different in size, and we were astounded to learn that we gave at least that much back and more. My guess is at New Hampshire we do that or more. And so I think we can, and I think it would behoove us to do that so that we had a way to show it. And so we do it in some ways. Cooperative Extension has a great blurb. Some of our colleges, they have great blurbs, but what we need to do is aggregate it up so we can tell the aggregate story about our land-grant institution.
Yeah, and I think, even quantifying something I don't do, quantifying is important. I think also just, we had a major flood in West Virginia that really hurt, a large part of our southern counties. Extension was there, engineers were there, researchers in water quality were there. When out in Flint, Michigan, when they were having the water crisis, Michigan State researchers were there. Sometimes we just don't tell our story very well, and we don't inspire ourselves enough to remind each other that we're doing these things. And just as and you did not suggest this. I'm just simply saying that extension is very important. The problem with extension is sometimes we think, oh, extension does that. Extension does service, right? My service load is serving on the promotion and tenure committee, right? I do that 10%. Right, but continuing to find ways to get faculty to engage with the state, to reward it, to include it into promotion and tenure decisions or in reward structures, because it can't just be something that an auxiliary unit does. If you're really going to live and breathe the land-grant mission, you have to find a way to include it in the work of all faculty and staff.
So, and one of the things that I would like to say to that is that since arriving at the University of New Hampshire, I do think it's through the core fabric of this institution, and I don't think it's just in Extension. I do know that Extension partners with units across the institution, but it's not just through those partnerships. It's through, it's in engineering, and it's in someone who is partnering with teachers and businesses in Manchester to bring computer and robotics education into the classroom. That's not through Extension at all. That just because they believe in that and they want to do that. So I think it's through the fabric of this institution, and I've been really impressed.
And since you're paying for my bill, I did not suggest that it wasn't.
Well, I just wanted to defend.
I'm such a strong supporter of everything you had.
I'm just defending our audience.
That seems like a good moment to open it up for questions from the audience.
So, Ken LaValle, I'm the Dean of Cooperative Extension here at UNH. I did not pay them for this. So, one thing that when you were talking, you were saying that Grange mentality, that from the core of the people. I'll tell you, Cooperative Extension nationally, we're undergoing a little bit of a identity moment. Who are we? Who do we need to be? And I will say the foundation of Cooperative Extension, at least at UNH, is relationships. And it's meeting people where they are. And that has allowed UNH Extension to evolve to meet the needs of a changing populace, a changing demographic at UNH. And to be honest, about 25% of our programs are ag now. We're much different, and I think every extension organization in this country is going through the same change. So I think what we are at UNH, and I've got to tell you, we are unique at UNH. And I would say that Cooperative Extension has it pretty good at UNH in terms of the collegiality, the willingness to partner in new and different ways. It's really not seen across all the extension programs. So I would say we definitely are a fabric. Certainly, Cooperative Extension, the land-grant mission, it's part of who we are at UNH. Never had doors closed on Cooperative Extension. And really our whole role is to be UNH out there. So I'd say we talk about funding and the difficulties with funding that we're having at the state level, but I think it's important to remind people that we have 10 counties in New Hampshire, and each one of those 10 counties is continuing to support UNH. And they support UNH through supporting Cooperative Extension. That means they see value in UNH. Extension is not this thing that the University of New Hampshire has. It is part of UNH. We are UNH when we're out in the field, and people hear that and they get it. So, you know, I could go on and on and on, but I probably would, Jan. But, you know, I would say a lot of what you said really struck me because the history you gave, you know, move the clock 100 years, that same history is happening. We've had people stand up and say, we want a practical education. We want to know that at the end of this tunnel, we can do something. We also have lifelong learners, a huge population that they already have their degrees, but now they want to change gears, and they use the university through a number of sources, not just extension, to meet those needs. So I think it's really interesting, the story you gave, because I think we're kind of repeating history in a number of ways right now.
Anyone want to rebut any of that? No. Cameron? No, we have one over there. Okay. Ken.
I'm Ken Johnson from the Carsey School and also from the Department of Sociology. I think another thing that you haven't mentioned that is important about what the land-grant schools do is to document and research the history and the conditions in rural areas of whether economically, socially, demographically, environmentally. That they've done that for a long time, and in a society that often forgets about rural America, they've done a lot to document what rural America is.
My partner's a rural sociologist at WVU. So I agree with your point.
So Cameron Wake from EOS and the Sustainability Institute. I want to build on something that Ken mentioned, but maybe pose it as a question. I was really taken by your sort of history of the influence of the Grange. And so I'm wondering, where are those Grange voices today? Who are those external voices that are really driving and asking for change of the land-grant institutions?
So the history of populism is really tricky because some people see them as a progressive force of change, and some people see them as conservatives that want to keep things the way they are always. Are there elements of the Grange that remind me of, that the Tea Party reminded me of sometimes? Yes. Was the Bernie Sanders movement sometimes kind of had Grange elements? Yes. The Grange, to me, and especially when we look at New England, we didn't see some of the nationalistic kind of populism that we saw in some other places. I think when you're talking just about higher education, I think there's voices out there that sometimes look at higher education institutions, land-grant institutions, I don't know if that's working anymore, that look at land-grant institutions and see it as an alien entity, right? The same type of cultural kind of critiques, anti-intellectualism, or, they're in their ivory tower. There's a distance, right? You look at the voting in the last election, quite a bit of difference between folks with a higher education and those with not. We're accepting that there's some of that distance. So I think there's a voice in there that we probably haven't done enough to connect with rural places. That's what that kind of suggests to me. But there's also progressive elements out there too that are saying these places need to be more accessible. That these places need to connect more because I need to have a job when I'm done with this because I'm putting a lot of money into it. So that's a real jumbled answer and gave you everything. But it's really complex. I mean, some days I really am with the Grange in some of the things that they did, and some of the times they did some really nasty things in Rhode Island to get the president thrown out. That was really cultural. That was really kind of just a power grab that we see with populism too. So mixed bag, but I think there's good and some not good lessons to derive from that history.
Jan?
So in the history, how do you frame community colleges? So for example, in the last 8 years, people aren't talking about supporting four-year public land-grant universities. They're talking about supporting community colleges and access.
Yeah. So, one thing we didn't talk at all about in the history, we look at 20th century land-grant development. What happened when America went to college in a massification environment was the first places that students filled were land-grant institutions. These had the top faculty or state universities. Then they went to the regional colleges, right? So that means land grants became more selective, right? And then we still had demand. And community colleges, when I think about the real democracy's colleges, you think of community colleges. So this is I'm not saying that community colleges, just serve that mission. They do a lot of other things too. But the access mission, reconciling the access mission with the selectivity of land-grant institutions or universities have always been a little bit of a challenge. So when America really went to college, community colleges were there to bring them in. So I think they're important partners. I think land-grant institutions reaching out to community colleges, creating transfer pathways, making sure that you can start there and come to our institution. But no, there's that land-grant mission, the industrial classes. Since these were founded in the 1950s and 1960s, community college has been carrying the burden of the most difficult access, and sometimes they get punished for it because they don't have the best outcomes and get performance funding for that, but they're doing the heaviest lifting of the industrial classes today.
Okay, I think we have someone here.
As a 13-year president of a community college and 20 years at UNH, and now a member of the New Hampshire House Education Committee, I can tell you that the reason that community colleges are successful is they have a pitch. You've heard of Making America Great Again? A single message. I don't particularly agree with it, but I don't have an answer. Representative Smith's on House Appropriations, Senator Waters is here, that getting a clear identity for the university of today and making it resonate with people who may not understand a research mission, for example, is difficult. The other question I wanted to ask you, though, is when I studied the history of these institutions at my doctoral program in Vanderbilt, they talked about the fact that the reason the Morrill Act passed was that we had lost thousands of officers in the Civil War. And one reason why it played so well is that the land-grant universities were to recreate the officer corps that had been depleted during the Civil War. And as a politician, I'm always interested in what actually happened. Did you pick up any of that? Because I believe every land-grant university was required to have an officer corps, my understanding.
Yeah, so military tactics was, yes, part of the legislation. The support of that was really mixed at different institutions. I think the place that plays out most accurately is in the South, places like Texas A&M, what becomes Virginia Tech. In the failed Confederacy, many of those institutions were less agricultural at the beginning. They had barracks. They had a lot of, I call it reconstructing the Confederate manhood in the South through these kind of military activities. But there were people in the North, no doubt, that saw the land grants as a way, along with all the other building the infrastructure of the federal government, rebuilding, modernizing the military, actually bringing the states back together. All these things were ideas that were batted around within the Civil War context. But I'm not downplaying the military part. And there's many land-grant institutions that send a lot of boys to die in a lot of wars. But as a driving principle, the places I'm aware of that mostly being front and center were places like Texas A&M and Virginia.
Here.
Yes, I'm Bill Burnson. I'm a faculty member here in the College of Life Science and Agriculture. One of the things that I've noticed over the course of my career is that it seemed that when I was younger, most of the faculty researchers pursued things that were of interest to them personally, or things that they felt would benefit their constituents, their stakeholders, and so on. Now we hear a lot about, and we talked earlier because of the budget constraints, linking more with the private sector and so on. We talk a lot about commercialization and so on. And I'm just wondering how you think those forces may reshape the university and the positive and negative aspects of that. I'm just kind of curious about that.
Well, so I can just give you my opinion on this. So I see it as a continuum. I don't see it as an either or. I see us as a university committed to basic understanding, and some of that's basic scholarship. I also see us committed to applied work. And everyone is not committed to every aspect of that, but as a community, we're committed to supporting that. And I think that today's applied innovations are the basic work that was done previously, right? So I see things moving along a continuum. And so the basic work is an underpinning for the future. And what we have in some of the applied work today is what we're helping to innovate and translate out now. And we can translate that out better when we're partnering with the people who are using it and who can help us to change it and improve it and work forward with it. So that's why I think partnering with the private sector, partnering with public sector is important. But I think it's always been important for a land-grant institution. I think of all the advisory boards that we have, like let's go back to the early days and today, within the Ag Experiment Station, COLSA, with Cooperative Extension, with the advisory boards that we have that bring the practitioners, the public sector in, and they're giving us, we're telling them, we're showing them some things, and they're saying, no, you should be doing this, we need this over here. And so it's a partnership, it's a feedback loop, and that's always been true. And I think that now we've just expanded it. It continues to be true in the agricultural sector. Food systems are still really important. But we've also expanded and broadened that, and that's to Ken's point, that 25% of what they do in Cooperative Extension now is agriculture. The rest is other kinds of things that enhance. And so I guess that's what I would say.
Yeah, and I would just say, it doesn't have to be an either or. University of California's research that connected innovation, commercial application, built Silicon Valley, got the internet going and employed a lot of people, and they're doing really well. Right? And we see that with state partnerships and innovation zones and regional development clusters. The issue is that when you counter, if that pursuit, right, if you're only rewarding commercial application, if you're only giving internal grants for seed money for commercial applications, the history department's like, that's a simple kind of dichotomy, but we have to recognize that basic research and maintaining, the culture and history and arts and aren't lost in our need to have to pursue that commercial application to balance our budgets.
Hi, I'm Joel Seligman, University of New Hampshire. This is fascinating conversation. Curious about your observations about the role or the influence of the land-grant movement on advancement of co-education and integration of higher education.
Yes. So now for the second session. And thank you for asking it that way. It also could have been, hey, where were all the women in any of your talk? So thank you for framing it that way. So the first female student connected to a Dartmouth program was through the UNH program, and it would be another 100 years before there was another one at Dartmouth, right? Co-education and land-grant institutions go hand in hand from very early on. The problem is that the discourse around the Land-Grant Act, also from very early on, was this practicality thing. Right? A lot of people put that front and center, that these were institutions that were, uniquely situated to prepare you for a job. And why would women come here unless they're troublemakers or what? Like why, so they got a lot of, pioneering women got a lot of pushbacks. And then as my students ask, well, why did they go? And I said, they went for a lot of reasons. They were the best students in their academy class. They were the best students in their district school, and they loved learning and they wanted to keep doing it. So, you have all these examples of early land-grant women who are both pioneers into fields that were originally closed to them. In the 1800s, we have women at land-grant institutions that would go up to Seneca Falls and, lay the groundwork for women, to vote. So outside the private, kind of sector of where women were going at places like Mount Holyoke or the Seven Sisters early on, land-grant institutions are really a big part of that story, and it's not a story that's been told very well. But women did have it difficult both at the beginning because of the practicality part, and then at land grants like Cornell, my friend here who went to Cornell, once Cornell wanted to be more like an institution like Eastern institutions, right? Cornell would have been the only Ivy that had women. It was tough for women early on because of that, in that state college movement, right? That they made them less of a college somehow. So women faced it from both sides, as land grants were both on the practical and other, but they persevered, and you can trace many of the great political advances in early women's rights, first wave feminism, to land grant participation.
So I have a question.
I'll throw in a footnote more on the Grange. The Grange, from its organization in 1867, had women as full equals, and women in the Grange movement can hold any office in the order starting in 1867. And I would submit that that had a very profound impact on many of the public policy positions that the Grange movement would take down through history. Here in New Hampshire, most notably in the area of education and in fixing child labor laws and things like that. So give a shout out for the Grangers and their treatment of women.
And it was absolutely, and it was in extension. It was those home economics demonstration agents that were going out boiling diapers like we talked about, but it was also on campuses too. There's been a tendency to look at home economics departments on land-grant campuses in those late 1800s as a place that women went that were domestic kind of courses that weren't rigorous. That might have been true early on in the 1850s and 1860s with some of the early domestic courses out in the Midwest. But these women were doing real science that other people weren't doing. They were the only ones looking at questions of sanitary science, of questions of issues in urban environments related to water and sewers. These were questions they were asking that no other scientists were. We see, women that came to UNH to study science, then would go on to MIT. So there's a rich history, and they were doing important work. I would just echo that.
They were persistent women. I get one. So, by the way, are these students who ask you why they went to college, are those male students or female students?
Yeah. I think that was probably, that sounds like a male question.
Yeah, that's what I thought. I was just asking.
I think, the women just got that. You're
yeah,
right.
Over here.
Hey, I'm not really sure how to put what I'm thinking in a question, but I am Dennis Ward, president of New Hampshire Farm Bureau, so I sort of see the other side of things a little bit. Your discussion has been extremely fascinating here. One of the things that might have been Steve that talked about was the Grange was a little irritated because the schools were trying to educate the kids more than they wanted. They wanted farm boys coming back, but as I travel around the state, I get to see more and more farms and different types of farms, and I am just astounded at the young people on these farms. I believe are better educated than a lot of the scientists and whatever in this country. I went to a sugaring operation, and the young kid talked about his vacuum system and his reverse osmosis systems, and he talked in scientific terms. It's like, I don't understand what you're talking about. I've been to vegetable farms, and these guys understand every day what causes that plant to grow and exactly what they need to do, the nutrients, the light, the heat, everything. It is somewhere they got this education, and I'm not sure they all came from the University of New Hampshire, but there is a change. Extension is a big part. I think they grew up with New Hampshire Farm Bureau, as a matter of fact, but they are a big part in the education in rural America. But it isn't just the other people that need this land grant. Saying the farm boys and the farm and the women, that issue. In New Hampshire, I'm not sure the exact percentage, but it is a huge number of women that own the farms, that have these vegetable farms, these dairy farms, or whatever.
No.
Thank you.
Thanks for sharing that. And just to be clear, I was talking about that in an earlier era, but I agree with you totally. I mean, we know the problems. We know that we have to figure out how to feed an additional billion people by 2050 on this globe, and we need really smart scientists to help us do that. And as the kicker, we also can't use a whole bunch of fossil fuels because we don't want to, overwarm the planet. I mean, we have intractable issues in agricultural sustainability. I think there are a lot of really bright people that are getting involved in this. And yes, definitely, I don't want to see land grant institutions go away from that core mission, because once again, I think the world is going to look to these institutions for new agricultural modernization to feed the population and save the planet.
I think was there a hand over here that I saw? Yeah, I think we have time for like one more, so.
Lindsay Williams, I'm a PhD candidate in natural resources here at UNH, and I appreciate the panel tonight. I actually grew up near the Morrill Homestead, so I remember being dragged there and not really understanding why I was being taken there, but I have since learned. My question is actually, as we look to the future, in part also on the intersection of land grant institutions and the model programs that came after, so space grant, seed grant, and how that sort of intersection comes together and what that means for our future, both for the institutions and for the communities and the industries that rely on this whole suite of these programs that have come out sort of modeled after land grant.
So I think that, so your question is about how all of the, so it is clear, I mean, Sea Grant, Space Grant, they're all modeled on the land grant scaffolding, if you will, and partner a lot and use a lot of the extension, the three-legged stool, the idea that you're doing the education, the research, and the extension, and that it's a loop, feedback loop with your constituency, with the people that are in the field. And I think that it is, if we can think of it as a force multiplier, that it's just taken the land grant piece and now extended it into the ocean and into space. And I think that's a terrific model to use.
Yeah, and we all know that some of these programs have an uncertain future. All I would say is the Morrill Act, the Space Grant, Sea Grant, there was a time, it's hard to remember, these were bipartisan programs. That some of the answers just come from if we can move beyond how polarized some of our politics has become. These are winning ideas for rural America, for urban America. These are winning ideas for the socially mobile and the people that are doing well, people who want to start businesses and people who want to start farms. Investing in science is just a win for everybody. But that's just me speaking. I think we have a responsibility as public intellectuals, as citizens, to know about this, to speak that these type of programs, investment in science, is not just something faculty members do, and it's just something that they're playing with. That these have downstream benefits for economic development, improving communities, and there's not a space for that right now. But I hold out hope that we can return to a little more sanity in that regard.
So having just been on New Hampshire Public Radio talking about the president's budget, I will just interject this, which I think what we are going to discover is that these things are, in fact, still, to varying degrees, but still are, in fact, do enjoy bipartisan support. And just because the president of one party proposes something and makes a recommendation doesn't mean that speaks for his entire political party. And I think we're going to see that in the process that goes forward from here.
There's one more?
Okay, we can do one more. Yep. Do we have a mic right down here, up front? So.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'm Lorraine Merrill. I'm an alumna of the University of New Hampshire, a farmer who has a family farm 8 miles down the road. My family has had an incredibly, long and rich history with both Extension and the university. And I've had the honor of succeeding Mr. Taylor as Commissioner of Agriculture for the state for nearly 10 years now. I just want to say, our Department of Agriculture, Markets, and Food, every single division relies on people at the University of New Hampshire, both in Extension and especially COLSA, but throughout. And I know from my colleagues that is true of many, many departments of state government. And I think I have seen in my adult lifetime here a real cycling back to rediscovering the land-grant mission and roots of this university, really recommitting to it. I think we see it in the ocean work, the climate work, the COLSA and the Ag Experiment Station, really coming back to those roots and realizing that those fields and those studies and research really have a very broad reach too, and it's of interest nationally and globally. So, and to just finish up, hosting here the Carsey School, what the Carsey School has brought here in terms of the focus on rural communities and rural issues is huge, both for the state of New Hampshire and beyond. So thank you.
Thank you. Well, since we're applauding anyway, why don't we continue that and applaud Nathan, Nancy, and Steve for this discussion.